All right. Welcome, everybody, to this conversation that I'm having today with Stephen Reid. Stephen, thank you for taking the time to be here with me.
Yeah, pleasure.
And you mentioned before we started that you're connecting in from a new place, that you're staying in Sweden. So congrats
Yeah,
on the recent
it's
move.
exactly, yeah, from the beginning of this year. So I'm starting to settle in now. But yeah, certainly a big change from the southwest of the UK where I was living the past 5 years.
Yeah, cool. Congrats on that. And yeah, today we're connecting because I reached out to Stephen recently after seeing the launch of a new course that he's doing called Technological Metamodernism. And I was so excited about the course that I sent it to one of my friends and a co-founder and business partner, Chris Ewald. I sent him the link and I was like, hey, check this out. This is really cool. And he immediately signed up because he's a meta modern nerd himself and just loved what you're doing there. So I thought it'd be cool to, yeah, talk together, explore a little bit around what brought this course into being. What is it? The kinds of things you're exploring right now, all of which for me as a kind of Buddhist geek and entrepreneur and technologist feel really relevant and important, especially today when it's becoming clearer and clearer that technology isn't the sort of solution for everything that perhaps some think. So yeah,
Mm.
I'd be curious to hear if there's a way forward that doesn't involve just the standard sort of degrowth or going back to the past kind of models that some people seem to propose when they look rightly at the criticisms around the impacts of technology and technological developments. Anyway, great to practice with you, or I guess this is a practice. Great to be here with you and talk.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that turn of phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's true. I want to just share a little bit of your bio and then we can maybe jump in. So
Mm.
Stephen is a transdisciplinary technologist, a facilitator, and Dharma student who's has trained in the fields of AI, machine learning, complexity science, physics, transformative coaching, and insight meditation. Current projects include hosting immersive residencies as a co-founder of FutureCraft, consulting for top organizations on AI projects, and leading the development of the Dandelion platform for regenerative events, and co-creating gatherings as part of a not-for-profit worker co-op called Symbiota. Seems like you've done a lot of interesting work now and in the past. And curious to start with the Dharma piece first, maybe,
Mm.
because I know a little bit about your background. You mentioned maybe studying with Rob Burbea at one point. I'm curious, what is your background in the Dharma insight world?
Sadly, not with Rob himself.
Okay.
I arrived to Gaia House just too late. Yeah.
Ah, sorry to hear that.
Um, I've now worked with a number of people that he trained and qualified. Yeah, mainly at Gaia House, which is this meditation center in the southwest of the UK, which, as good fortune would have it, was very close to where I was living. I moved to Totnes in Devon, actually
Mm,
barely knowing anything about Gaia House, and then it actually became a big part of my life. I think I've spent like more than a month there in silent retreat over the past couple of years,
mm,
along with other retreats with the similar set of teachers. And it's really taken my Dharma practice to a whole new level. It's been really wonderful to discover.
mm.
And in particular, the work on Rob's work on emptiness, the book Seeing That Frees, that perhaps you've heard of already, even that
Yeah,
makes a
for
big
sure.
impact on many people, was a real unlock for me. First reading the book and then actually going on kind of emptiness flavored retreats with people like Yahel Abagur and Catherine McGee and
Hmm.
so on. Yeah, just feeling so grateful to have discovered that very rich vein down in the southwest there.
And this is something that people know about Rob Burbea and they know about metamodernism, which I'm not going to assume anyone listening to this will know either. But if you do,
Mm-hmm.
you'll know that Rob was a unique Dharma teacher in that he didn't tend to make sense of the same Dharma tradition, the insight tradition, in a way that a lot of his teaching colleagues were.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of ways, my experience coming up in that tradition was like most people were saying more or less the same kind of stuff. And there was even a kind of a monoculture I experienced at the Insight Meditation Society, where it's like, and I don't mean this a little critically, but I also just think this is what happens at a certain stage of cultural development, where everyone is just copying the founder and everyone is replicating the same ideas. So it was really interesting to run across Seeing That Freeze and some of others, Rob's work personally, and see that he seem to have gone beyond the standard modern interpretation of the tradition. He wasn't just trying to
Mm-hmm.
replicate this system. He was talking about different ways of seeing and how perspective itself is tied up with liberation. And I hadn't really heard that from a lot of my insight teachers. I'd heard it from Ken Wilber, who was my first mentor, but I hadn't seen that kind of thinking penetrate deeply into the insight tradition. Maybe a little with Jack Kornfield's work on enlightenments, looking at enlightenment from different angles. But something about Rob's work felt even a little more than just pluralistic Dharma. There's just these different ways of experiencing enlightenment. It seemed like he was maybe going beyond that in terms of his perspective taking. Curious your thoughts on that, being a metamodernist meditator.
Yeah, for sure. So he certainly had as what I understand to be quite a radical view with regards to emptiness and this idea of ways of looking that these ways of looking are essential to his work. He even describes things like metta or anicca or anatta simply as ways of looking, which is not something that I had heard about through other teachers, and really emphasizes that these ways of looking can be in service of freedom and compassion and joy and positive qualities that we might want to experience in our lives. It tells this story about the way that we look affects what we perceive, which then affects the world we experience. And
Right.
actually, by starting to look in different ways, we actually, for example, if we start to look through the eyes of love, we start to perceive a loving world, which then means we start to experience love in our lives. And I feel like I'm still just at the very beginning of this journey in many ways, but something is really landing for me. Yeah, this emphasis on ways of looking was certainly something a bit different. And then I understand actually he was struggling to finish Seeing It Freeze, because by the time that he was finishing the book, at least, he was actually onto his next thing, which was the soul-making Dharma, which maybe you're somewhat familiar with also, which really centers the role of imagination and creativity and developing a kind of personal myth or mythos. And that also is something certainly slightly beyond the kind of standard Buddhist canon, as a kind of, I've heard it described as post-Buddhist. But for him, it absolutely fits with his work on emptiness and his radical view of emptiness, in the sense of after you've deconstructed everything, including even ultimately like ways of looking themselves, what now, what next? And soul-making Dharma was like the kind of answer to that question in a way. It's like, well, what do you want to imagine? What are the stories that you would like to inhabit? And it's a bit more subtle than that, perhaps. He certainly makes a real distinction between imagination and the imaginal, where the imagination is something that is maybe effortful on our part, like I'm choosing to imagine something, and the imaginal is more like a kind of visitation, or it's like it's an arrival of some other and feels like more like a conversation with a spirit or a force or something of this type that's one can have the sense is like not just oneself or is outside of oneself in some kind of important way. Ultimately, where you draw the line between those two is a tricky issue or a matter of preference, we could say. But yes, plenty to explore there.
Yeah, and I mean that feels consistent to me, what you just described, with also going past modernism, because the modernist is obsessed with the self and the individual, tends to interpret everything in terms of the self and in terms of, it's just some facet of your own mind that you're interacting with here, and everything is just that. Of course not. Maybe there are things outside of us that are ontologically valid, that are interacting with us, that may not be just like other humans or other things. I think that's an interesting, to me, indicator that someone isn't just playing around in the modern space. They can include that back in some view.
There's something of a correspondence between Rob's emptiness practices as being a kind of like extremely radical flavor of postmodernism, and then the soul-making Dharma as being the kind of metamodern, like reconstructive move.
Postmodernism.
It depends how you look at it. Like I would actually, in ways, I'd say like the emptiness practices are profoundly deconstructive, that they themselves go beyond the postmodern map. But yeah, I think the correspondence between Rob's ideas and metamodern thinking is, I think, a fascinating topic. And actually, this is part of the history of how the course that I'm going to be soon teaching came to be. I was invited by the Hermes Amara Foundation, which was a foundation set up upon Rob's death, to deliver a presentation with a colleague on emptiness and metamodernism. And that ended up being a kind of comparative study of Hansi Freinacht and Rob Babea's writings, and making the case that there are some very striking parallels between their ways of thinking. And that was the first time I delivered any public content on metamodernism, although it's an idea that I've been thinking about and speaking about in private for some time. And so, inspired by the success of that talk, then a couple of months later, I was delivering a presentation on technological metamodernism at Zoo Berlin, a kind of Web3 flavored gathering in Berlin. And that also went well. So then I thought, okay, let's see if I can do a whole course on technological metamodernism, because it feels like there's a lot here. And I was delighted to convince a few fantastic other folks to join in. So, yeah, Hansi Freinack themselves, and then Ellie Hain from the Institute of Meaning Alignment, Alexander Beiner, who was formerly of Rebel Wisdom, Michael Garfield of Future Fossils, and Rufus Pollock of Life Itself, who are now very much concentrating on this second Renaissance project. Yeah, really looking forward to it, even for myself, to having juicy conversations with all of those folk in September.
Yeah, that's awesome. Maybe we could jump into the actual course. So this lives on your site, futurecraft.life. And for those that are interested, what is the focus of the course, or what are you all trying to explore in this?
Yeah, so I guess other than being inspired by these presentations on metamodernism, I've been tracking this debate between e-acts and doomers, these e-acts, these effective accelerationists, these technological progress at all costs folk that seem to be all over Twitter, or all over my Twitter feed at least.
Yep, same.
And then they critique what they call doomers or decels, who they perceive to be people that have an overly negative view of technological progress and are seeking to slow things down in the way that these e-acts feel is unhelpful. And certainly you can find a kind of neo-Luddite critiques out there. You can find people that are just say that this has all gone too far. We need to kind of return to some deep green civilization. I encountered some of this thinking in the context of Extinction Rebellion, for example, an activist movement that I was part of a few years back. And I guess I'm interested in what's the middle way, to borrow a Buddhist phrase as well, is like technological development at all costs, at a fastest pace as possible. Doesn't seem right to me, and it's not. I think you can make a very strong case about why that isn't a good way to go. But nevertheless, I can't deny my love for technology. Actually, I describe myself as a technologist, and so intuitively, I have this sense of the answer is not necessarily to go to wind the clock too many millennia back, but that raises the question: what exactly is this middle way then? And metamodernism, which we can get into in a bit more detail in a bit if that's useful, but is a philosophy that is all about synthesis, the kind of like taking the modern thesis with the postmodern antithesis, and to create something that is not just in between. So let's be careful about using that term middle way, because so it's actually about transcending and including the two. So finding the best in both those, that modern and postmodern perspective, or in this case we could say the kind of the e-ac and the doomer perspective, but coming up with something qualitatively new. And this another way that metamodernists would talk about it is this really encouraging this both and thinking. I had a hunch, and a hunch is growing stronger as I do more research for this course, that metamodern thinking could be very useful in somehow transcending this what's become for me quite boring and unhelpful debate actually between tech good, tech bad. Surely we can bring more nuance and complexity to things than that.
Yes, this is great. There's so much good stuff here we can unpack. So what you're describing as the two kind of sides, the two extremes are the polarity, the e-ac and the doomer decels. I've often referred to these as the techno-utopianists and the eco-dystopianists. I think same pointer. And what is the middle way, which is more like a triangle rather than like in the middle of a line, like a point that emerges between and beyond the two extremes. Yeah, which is characterized, as you said, by both and, at least in the case of two things, you have both and thinking. So this is really interesting. And I agree, like most of the debate has been centered around these polar opposites. And either we just keep pushing forward, accelerating our technology every time we run into an issue, most of which come from previous implementations of technology. We just solve those with new solutions. I know one of the authors you're referencing here in this course, Daniel Schmachtenberger, he has, I think, some pretty powerful arguments against why that's a good idea and how that actually doesn't work, or it seems to be actually accelerating us toward towards self-termination. But at the same time, you're not just stopping with those critiques here. It doesn't sound like you're actually trying to figure out, is there actually a way forward that doesn't simply involve going back? And in some ways, with Schmachtenberger's work, I hear him in a way ending on, we should go back or roll things back, which doesn't, I'm curious how you see this middle way, or this both and possibility. What does that actually look like?
Yeah. So first I'll say that, Daniel's work has been a major influence or motivation to put on this course, in particular the two essays. The early one is Technology is Not Values Neutral, Ending the Reign of Nihilistic Design. And then more recently, a kind of book-length essay called Development in Progress, which is all questioning the very concept of progress and suggesting that we have a very immature relationship to progress in society right now.
Yeah.
And the third piece that's a major inspiration for the course is an essay by Vitalik Buterin, who's the co-founder of Ethereum, called My Techno-Optimism, which is where he describes what he calls a DAC. So as opposed to EAC, it was riffing off that previous meme.
What does EAC stand for?
Effective accelerationism.
Okay. Is that playing off of effective altruism somehow? It seems like those are
Exactly. There's this just chain of memes. So first effective altruism, and then effective accelerationism, or EAC, and then Vitalik said, actually, I think we need DAC. So the D, decentralized, defensive, or differential.
Okay.
He said it can stand for any of those.
Interesting.
And I would say, actually, you said you talked about going back, as in maybe with referring to these eco-pessimists, perhaps, or it was the phrase that you used?
Eco-dystopianists or eco-pessimists?
Eco-dystopianists. Okay, yeah. I would actually make the case that EAC actually represents a profound reversion, and a profoundly unhelpful reversion, actually, in that, and it's Daniel's thinking lays this out actually quite well, and I think better than Hansi's in a way. In that essay on values and technology, he lays out four kind of systems or types of design, what he calls naively optimistic design, which is this techno-optimistic, like that technology, positive values are inherently encoded in technology. And by building more technology, like the world necessarily gets better.
Cough, Kevin Kelly.
Okay, yeah. So then he talks about Luddite design, which is that technology is actually the negative values are inherently encoded into technology, and like the less technology, or if we use like the more technology we can design out of our lives, the better. Now that is actually that resonates with how Hansi Freinacht seems to write about the postmodern perspective on technology, but I would actually call that a kind of maybe early postmodern perspective, because this naively optimistic, the techno-optimist perspective came about around the Industrial Revolution. I would say that's like when there was so much excitement about technology. It must have seemed very easy to believe back then in many ways.
Right.
But that was also, and then this kind of what you could class as this kind of like early postmodern response was like this Luddite, like this first wave of Ludditism, if you like, of hey, no, this is not actually looking good in various ways. But this, I would say, the later postmodern response, which is kind of the phase that we're in now, is what Daniel calls nihilistic design. And this is this common trope that technology is neither good nor bad. It's all about how you use it.
Right.
And it's all about the technology is only as good or bad as the people that use them. And then that's the shot. And then the chaser is that, and actually, what is value anyway? Like this, the postmodernists would say, what even is this value or these values? And they kind of seek to deconstruct that, maybe say that value itself is simply a kind of culturally constructed phenomenon. So basically we can forget about value when it comes to technology, or it's not necessary.
It doesn't matter.
Not appropriate. It doesn't matter. It's not appropriate or necessary to talk about morality or ethics when it comes to technology, because like technology and it's like strictly separate from the fields of morality and ethics. Mm-hmm. So this is referred to as a nihilistic design, which is, I would say, the place that is the mainstream view when it comes to technology at this point. And then Daniel goes on to talk about axiological design. But just how I spoke about EAC as a reversion, I would actually say that given that most people are at this kind of late postmodern nihilistic design paradigm, EAC is, in a sense, it's going back to a techno-optimist paradigm. It's a reversion to what seems to me to be a quite modernist perspective, and that kind of makes sense. It's like when people get the sense that something is wrong here, something is broken, there's very often an instinct for some people to say, let's go back to the thing that worked before. Right. Let's go back to a worldview where we just believed, at least, that like technology was just good. It was inherently useful and positive, and let's just do that thing again. But I would suggest, and Daniel suggests, that isn't the move. The move is, actually something different is required here. And Daniel talks about that as axiological design, and axiology being the study of value. And the suggestion is that, we need to reunify the fields of value, morality, ethics, and technology, and consider really carefully about whether values are encoded in our technology, how they're encoded, what they are, and consider how the use or at least widespread deployment of a technology is likely to modify our values and what we value in society.
Yes.
Including in potentially unexpected ways, right? So so the suggestion is like, this is not necessarily something obvious. Like, you really need to put the work in. And so you can think of like social media is like a good example of this. There's plenty of statements from Zuckerberg earlier on in Facebook years saying he's basically suggesting his value is connectedness, and Facebook's mission is to connect the world. Right. And on a shallow level, that sounds good, and quite a lot of people went along with it. Who doesn't love connectedness? And there's almost a kind of ecological quality to it. This web of life, everything's connected. But the impacts of social media were obviously like much more complicated than just connecting people. There were plenty of other values encoded in that technology, which I think in retrospect, everyone would agree that we didn't put enough thought into. We didn't spend enough time considering what the impact of that technology would be. So Daniel's work is really cool for let's get really serious about contemplating the externalities of the technologies we're not even building, but thinking of building, which are both the kind of ecological but also the psychosocial. And ask some really tough questions about whether we should even proceed with the development of that tech.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that. That was something that struck me in reading and listening to his work, is around the nth order effects of whatever you build. Like, they have not just the immediate effects of the technology themselves, but then there's the unexpected second, third, plus order consequences. And I love his idea of yellow teaming, that of taking an idea of, you want to develop, say, a technology or solution to something, and actually trying to spend some real resources and time and energy considering what might those nth order effects be, and if they're bad, considering not doing them or not building it that way, or not building it at all. And that's rare.
Of course, the problem is that technology often confers power, and so you get these kind of arms races and multipolar traps where even supposedly good people are being driven to do possibly bad things by building the tech as fast as possible, because if anyone's going to have it, then we should have it, as he so eloquently
because we're the good
speaks
people.
About. Because we're the good people, and the better that we have the bad thing than anyone else.
Yeah.
But this will be, for anyone that's listened to his work, this will be all relatively familiar, I guess. And the place that he gets to after the yellow team is, I read it as two things. We need to take legal regulation from states and governments like much more seriously, and see that will almost inevitably continue to be a very important part of the puzzle. And hopefully, probably there's like a cultural piece as well, and that I think is some very interesting field, and which is we'll come onto that in the week 3 of the technological metamodernism course, when we're talking about things like ritual and initiation in tech, and art, and questioning beyond simply state regulation. Are there ways that we could bind each other's behavior in these tech communities through something like the use of like guilds or associations, or where we're simply where there's no legal obligation to behave in a certain way, but there's an extremely strong social obligation, and perhaps that often would come with, like, a guild might come with its own system of incentives and disincentives. If you do the right thing according to the morality of the guild, then you get access to certain places or rituals or whatever it might be, and if you defect from the guild, then there's some disincentive for defecting from the guild, that you maybe lose access to connections and certain other benefits. Actually, I think that is a rather underexplored area right now, and I also wouldn't be surprised if some of that kind of thing is starting to develop in particularly the kind of Silicon Valley AI scene, given the way things are going. But yeah, it's an area I'm looking forward to digging into more.
Yeah, that seems to like the most obvious example right now of the multipolar trap that I see every day in and day out are the conversations around AI. Just saw Mark Cuban on some podcast talking about AI. I think it's actually with Jon Stewart in The Daily Show. And he more or less just repeated the multipolar trap argument for why we have to continue pushing forward with AI. He's like, China's not going to stop doing it. These other people are going to stop doing it. So we have to do it. We have to do it the best. And to me, now that I'm very familiar with the multipolar trap, in part thanks to Schmachtenberger's work, I just find it's amazing to me how convenient and lazy of an argument that is for just continuing to move forward and do whatever you like.
Yeah, it's important, and it's important that people understand its ubiquity and how often it turns up in so many fields. What an important driver game theoretic and dynamics are. Yes. And I think for you and I, and probably for Daniel himself and for others, we've understood that dynamic pretty well. We've heard about it quite a lot now through this kind of network of wonderful podcasts and so on. And I think the question on many people's lips is, okay, so what now? And so that is maybe a good place to bring in Vitalik Buterin's work on defensive or decentralized or differential accelerationism. Because I would suggest that this is a kind of early and simplistic and form of axiological design, if you like. Because the question is obviously, so if Daniel and others are saying, we should do axiological design, it's like, what does that actually look like? Who's really doing that? And although I'm not sure Vitalik even knows about Daniel or Daniel's work, but I think DIAC has that flavor to it in a way. And because just as the foundations, like Vitalik starts his essay on DIAC with, I would say he certainly has more towards the techno-optimist side of things, but then takes a big chunk of time to say, but climate change. And he acknowledges that despite all of the kind of smaller scale good, which actually I think you can question, but he says the world is getting better in lots of ways, but there's this big elephant in the room, which is climate, which threatens to ruin everything. And so he goes on to suggest that this naive techno-optimist view has not been helpful. I think I have a nice quote for that. So he says, we need active human intention to choose the directions that we want, as the formula of maximized profit will not arrive at them automatically. And so he's saying, let's not just accelerate any old technology, which is basically it seems to be the argument of some kind of effective accelerationist, that technology is like inherently good, just do it and do it fast. He said, let's be really thoughtful about the kinds of technologies that we are accelerating or continuing to innovate with. And he goes on in detail to describe what he calls these defensive technologies. But the reason I would call this I would say this is a form of axiological design, is that if you read his essay, he's driven by one core value, it seems to me, which is freedom. So he is actually, the innovation pathway he's proposing is one which is in service of the value of freedom. I think there are other values encoded in the essay, but I think it's just really
like individual freedom, or what kind of freedom you think he's interested in?
Yeah, a lot of it does have this kind of individual freedom flavor to it, and we can get onto some of what he calls defensive technologies in a second to understand that a bit more. But I think underlying this in many ways is this. We could even say it's like this devaluing of value, like the way in which value is not part of the conversation about technology. And I think just start these conversations about what is it that you value, and how do you think the technology that you are developing is in service to these values, I think would be a really valuable conversation to be having at larger scale and more often. And because my sense is that there's a lot of people that don't really know what they value. They haven't really thought much about axiology, to use the fancy word for it. And if you don't really even know what you value, there's very little chance, or it's just random then whether the technology that you're building is going to be in service to the things which do value. And I think actually Buddhist geeks have an important role to play here, because Buddhism, as far as I've understood it and experienced it, it certainly does consider questions of value, of what really are like the most important principles by which we could live. So the Brahma Viharas come to mind, for example, and this real centering of loving kindness, compassion, empathic joy, equanimity. Like those to me are, you could say, are values in a way. So the question then would be like, so like how could, what technology could we build that would encode and promote those values, for example? But it's like you have to start with some set of values, and I accept that like the things that I value might be different to you and the next person and so on, and that's okay, I think. And I think also an interesting problem of then how do we start creating, is it possible to start creating some kind of, if not consensus, mutual understanding of the different things that people value in society? And one organization that's doing really interesting work, actually AI assisted work on that, is this Institute for Meaning Alignment, which Ellie Hayner is part of the course. That's another story. So Vitalik's DAC, this defensive accelerationism, he talks about it in terms of the world of atoms and the world of bits. And then in the world of atoms, he talks about micro defense and macro defense. And in the world of bits, he talks about cyber defense and info defense. So the place that the kind of analogy that he uses to get us going on this is this, as a kind of intuition pump, I like that phrase, is Switzerland. Switzerland has been neutral in many major wars for some centuries now. How is it that Switzerland is able to been able to effectively opt out? It's actually in a big part because it has very defense-favoring territory. It's surrounded by mountains. He uses this as an example of how they got lucky. They didn't have to construct these mountains. The mountains were there first, then Switzerland arrived. But like how if you have a defense-favoring landscape, it actually affords you the possibility to make very different choices. For example, no, we're not going to go to war because we don't need to, because you can't get in and it's hard for us to get out or whatever. And then that relative peace and prosperity has afforded actually quite a different kind of political system in Switzerland that's like highly decentralized, where most of the power is devolved to the cantons, the regions. He suggests that many people don't even know the name of the national president because it's actually not that important. And I do know that there's a heavy, like directly democratic part to Swiss politics, where they frequently have referenda, like that, where all the population can vote as a method of making decisions. And I think this is the kind of individual freedom that he's getting at, the individual freedom that he's interested in. An example of that would be direct democracy. Mm-hmm. So what kind of technology, for example, could promote direct democracy? Mm-hmm. But then go beyond that, the examples of the other technology he says. So when he talks about macro defense, actually he speaks a lot about just decentralized physical infrastructure, like decentralized energy generation, decentralized ways of growing food. The suggestion is that if you're not relying on corporations or the state for your energy, for your food, and for these kinds of things, then you're more free in some meaningful sense to say what you think and act how you think without being afraid that you're going to get thrown in prison or that you're going to get fired or whatever it might be. The micro defense he talks a lot about vaccines, and in particular decentralized production of vaccines, and which is not a field I know much about, but my sense is a very new field, new possibility that we could actually have something like 3D printers for vaccines, and actually that also not be some huge, something that's solely in the realm of the state, which of course creates so much conflict in so many countries. There's now this anti-vax debate, which was in large part due to the fact it was the state telling people to get vaccinated. Whereas what if that was decentralized? What if there were like vaccine printers in every home or every community? Then that debate would have had a very different quality to it. And then, so cyber defense, he talks about blockchains as an example of decentralized, uncensored like data infrastructure.
Right.
And then finally, the info defense. He talks about community notes. So this, which you'll probably be familiar with as a kind of ex-Twitter user, which is actually built on some very interesting technology. And despite my increasing dislike for the owner of that platform, like that has been something good, I think, to like essentially put that more to the front and center of things. Yeah, this I think is an interesting example, as I say, of a kind of axiological design, like promoting a certain kind of, I think maybe better than freedom, maybe the word is sovereignty, like a certain kind of like sovereignty for people to vote the way they want, to be able to provide for themselves without fear of being punished in some way by more powerful actors, to be able to exist on the internet in a way which again doesn't rely on centralized infrastructure from big tech companies and so on. Clearly, that's always been Vitalik's thing, and that's why he created Ethereum in the first place. Yeah, so I would say that Daniel's work and Vitalik's work are examples of technological metamodernism, where Daniel is laying some of the foundations and groundwork, and then Vitalik is, in a way, making these first tentative steps in a way towards applying a form of axiological design. So that's how the core of this fits together for me.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you for sharing that. It's interesting. I've seen the term sovereignty used a lot in these sort of meta-modern circles and among the liminal web, as it's sometimes called. Like that seems to be one of the core values, which makes sense to me. If I zoom back to training in the integral world, if I look at some of the models that talk about development, like there is this kind of reemergence of an emphasis on the self as an instrument, they describe it.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see that. At the same time, I notice there's a tension when I hear these kinds of descriptions of maximizing sovereignty, because if you just do that, then you create a lot more empowered people who can then do stuff to fuck with other people's sovereignty or take their sovereignty away. So there's this kind of interesting, to me, it's like between agency and communion, or agency and community. There's another tension that exists, because if everyone becomes more decentralized and empowered, then it's harder to coordinate across scale. And a lot of the problems we're dealing with are global scale issues, so that threaten all of our abilities to have sovereignty. This is an interesting area where, it's cool to hear that there are people trying to sort out solutions. And Vitalik's interesting, of course, because he started the Ethereum network, which it's not just philosophy, it's like an actual technology that people can use. And please, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say in the broader metamodern landscape, we would say that the metamodern tech is both more individualistic and more communal. So if Vitalik is developing kind of metamodern flavored tech to promote the freedom of the individual and sovereignty, like very probably that will need to be balanced out somewhere else by technology that encodes much more kind of communal communitarian values. And it's certainly metamodernism is not just for me it's not just about sovereignty. It's actually it's also about the opposite of that, but doing both of those things better than before. Hansi talks about outcompeting capitalism, which has a similar slightly absurdist flavor to it, and how the kind of metamodern politics is simultaneously both more left than standard leftist politics and more right than standard rightist politics. It continues to have this sense of really transcending and including, and never just like thinking that any single value is the answer, and if we just head in that direction, then we're going to resolve things here. But even below that is just this conversation about values and technology. And I was actually thinking, Vincent, you talked about yourself as now a startup founder, and I know I've had a taste of some of the things that you're building with meditate.ai. I hope that's okay to utter those words on this podcast, but I don't know how public and open it is all yet. But I'm curious to know to what extent values are coming into the technology that you're building and developing, and how explicit that is as the technology that you're building in service to some values, and if so, what are they, and how did you find them, discover them?
Yeah, for sure. The company you're mentioning, Interbeing Inc., it's a benefit corporation, so we're legally required to fulfill our legal purpose, which is improving the well-being of all humans using multiplayer meditation practices. So it's really fundamentally about, in the mental health and well-being space, looking at really the problems of modernity and the negative effects of what happens when you're hyper-focused on individual rights and individual experience, which seems to be hyper disconnection right now. Like, we're experiencing an epidemic of isolation and loneliness, I think globally, but here in America, it's really it's felt quite strongly because of what an individualistic kind of ideology our country has. So it's really about trying to respond to that and say, hey, there are other ways of meditating that don't just involve going inward and being with yourself, but could also include being with yourself and others, or even with the world all together at once, including all of those as valid sources of experience and interwoven sorts of kind of experience. So yeah, for sure, values it's at the very heart of what we're doing. And the way we discovered it was through practicing these practices and through going through the transformation that was involved.
Yeah. I would even say that this technology itself is balancing out some of Vitalik's suggestions. Like, Vitalik's is how can we defend the sovereignty of the individual, and then your technology is saying actually no, ours is about how can we become more relational. It's a very different vector in a way and I would say we want both. Or is it possible to want both? How can we imagine a technological future where we are simultaneously like more sovereign and also more relational? This makes me think of Daniel's work actually about talking of not just like isolated technologies, but if I remember how he speaks about it, like ecologies of technologies and infrastructures, which are kind of sub-ecologies of technology, and then whole technological epochs. This is, can we start to imagine what like a kind of ecology of metamodern technology would look like? I think actually it actually makes much more sense to think about metamodern technology in that kind of as an ecology, and rather than just rather than saying, oh, this is a metamodern technology and this isn't. I don't think you can really know whether any given technology is unless you see it embedded in that whole landscape. And then at some point I imagine it would be great for people like yourself and Vitalik to actually have conversations and actually maybe more explicitly contemplate how the different technology that you're building or promoting is coming into some kind of balance or dynamic equilibrium that is serving some holistic set of values.
Yeah, interesting. Just contemplating where to go from here in this conversation, because I feel like we've covered like a good high level, the abstract high level. I find my mind zooming into specifics. So for instance, thinking about open source, and you're doing an interesting thing with this course in which you're raising funds in order to be able to open source the content from it. And you're using the quadratic funding, which is something that developed on the Ethereum platform, as I understand it. I think Vitalik maybe is the one who first wrote about that. And then our mutual friend, Kevin Owocki, and the Gitcoin community developed tools where you can actually do that. So you've got an interesting project there. It occurred to me while you're talking that like a big part of the challenge with open sources is it seems to be either open source or proprietary are the kind of two extremes here. And it occurs to me like I used to love the idea of open source, and now I'm not so certain, because I can see that actually open sourcing technology for everyone can actually accelerate a lot of these issues and problems, while at the same time maybe making things more available to everyone. Great. And now it's more available to the bioterrorist who wants to print out a novel like bioterror weapon and distribute it. So, okay, that's not good. But it occurs to me what you were saying earlier about values and creating a kind of culture or norms around like how we operate together as technologists or particular guilds, for instance. I wonder if there's a possibility for like open source within the context of people who share your values. It's if you break these norms, you don't get access to the common goods of this community. Like, you lose access to the swimming pool. You keep pissing in it, you're going to kick you out of the swimming pool. It doesn't mean it's not still open to everyone else who continues to respect and honor the commons. But I wonder if there's novel solutions like this that we need to be thinking about, where it's not just either completely open or completely closed, but we start making a little bit more distinctions around who we share our goods with and who we share our tech with.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting idea. I said I have some kind of intuition almost that the re-emergence of guilds or secret societies or something like this within the technological community actually could be quite helpful as like an alternative or an addition to regulation by the state. And you and one of the carrots of actually participating in these things, you could well imagine, could be like shared intellectual property. And it's open source has, it's another discussion, but there's plenty of problems with open source, and not least the fact that so many developers of open source projects are like critically underpaid and underfunded.
Right.
Too many people are just happy to take the technology and use it without giving anything back. And which then but then of course some of these open source projects are mission critical, and when a bug does turn up, everyone's saying you must fix this to these poor guys that maybe barely earned a dime from it. And
they're doing it on the
kind
side.
Of thing actually this is the kind of thing actually that Gitcoin was developed to solve. So Gitcoin is this best known for its quadratic funding, match funding rounds, and they actually initially I think started with a kind of singular focus on open source software. And as at least a partial answer to this problem of how can we sustainably fund open source software. And since that time, which is probably, 5 years ago now, they've expanded the range of match funding rounds that they run with partners, or now kind of people can actually independently. Gitcoin has now become just a protocol, so anyone can actually just go and create a quadratic funding round in a permissionless way, which is, I think, is very neat. But they do every few months. They run featured rounds, and so the technological metamodernism course is currently in the Open Civics Collaborative Research Round. I think I said that correctly. And the idea is that I've pledged to open source the notes and very probably the recordings as well, as long as they turn out of sufficient quality and utility. Pledged to open source all of that in exchange for the match funding that I'm going to be receiving from this funding round. And so I'm gonna do that no matter how much I raise now. I hope it's more towards the $6,000 cap than the other end of the spectrum. If you're finding some of this content useful and you would like to see these notes and just know that they're accessible to the world, then people are so welcome to head over to the Open Civics round and chuck in a few dollars. The nature of quadratic funding is that the number of donors matters as much as the amounts donated. That's a pretty gross simplification, but it will do for now. It's not just if you donate $10, we know that you will match it with $10. Like you can actually, even just a $5 or $10 donation could potentially be matched by hundreds of dollars in match funding if that project has a large number of individual donors. So it's a democratization of match funding. What's exciting about the Open Civics round is that for the first time, people can donate via PayPal and donate because previously it was crypto donations only, which was a major barrier for a lot of people, just like getting a crypto wallet and getting Ethereum for gas and all this kind of stuff. Really excited to see that these very smart folks at Via Prize have built this kind of PayPal layer over the top of that. And I think Gitcoin and quadratic funding has a very bright future. Actually, it seems to be a fantastic way of doing this, or example of collective intelligence and allowing a community to together feel into what are the most valuable projects in a certain space.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I want to maybe moving toward wrapping up our conversation. I noticed that you've got some interesting, the last week of your course on technological metamodernism, you've got some tech futures that you're exploring. You mentioned solar punk, lunar punk, the role of art, design, fiction. We're going to talk about metamodern DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations, AI, reality switch technologies. You mentioned DMT, lucid dreaming. This is obviously in the wheelhouse of the Buddhist Geeks world. Curious if you could talk a little bit about the tech futures that you're imagining that are tied to this approach.
Yeah, sure. I think there certainly seems to be this very important hyperstitive effect, we could say, like this effect to do with hyperstition, that like we build the tech futures that we can imagine, and or maybe even more important is the corollary, which is like we cannot build tech futures that we cannot imagine. And so to actually take the time to imagine like what are 50 or 100 years or however much more down the line the ways in which we would like technology to be used. What could be the role of technology in a solar punk, which is a kind of like high tech but like high eco society of the future, look like? This lunar punk for me is it's not opposed to solar punk. It's an extension of solar punk for me, which is actually like for saying, okay, be like high tech, high eco, and also with real spiritual depth, like how, and which is the field that you're working in actually right now, like actually using technology in service to spiritual development, we could say.
I still remember your Lunar Punk Dreams podcast. I see there was only two,
right,
and I was the first guest.
Yeah. That was got pretty unlucky with the timing for that, given there was all that was going on in the Web3 world. But yeah, I think the idea of lunar punk, I think, is still very interesting and important, and like missing from the many solar punk visions that somehow don't seem to talk much about the role of spirituality and religion and personal development.
Agriculture and solar panels.
So Into Being Inc. is definitely has like a lunar punk flavor to it for me in that sense. Like I'm a pretty keen reader of science fiction of this flavor of the solar punk lunar punk flavor, and there's really a dearth of it. I would love to see like way more of this stuff out there. And I'm one of the conversations I'm interested in having is how can we do that? Maybe we need a Gitcoin quadratic funding round for solar punk and lunar punk fiction. That's something that like comes to mind in this moment and like ties the previous part of the conversation.
Yeah, we need our Neil Stephensons out there writing things, right?
But let 1,000 solar punk, lunar punk novels bloom. I think that's actually a really important part of this. It isn't just about the kind of highly technical conversations about AI safety and game theoretic traps and so on. There has to be a role for creativity and imagination in this, which that actually speaks to the work of Paul Levy and his writings on Wetiko, that's another big topic. This is indigenous North American concept about this cannibalistic mind virus that they perceived or suggested that white settlers were suffering from, that these white settlers couldn't see that they were like eating themselves in the sense of like plundering the earth in an unsustainable way. And Paul, in his books that I found profoundly interesting, makes the case that it is imagination and creativity, which is the kind of antidote to Wetiko, to this we could just say capitalistic mind virus, which so many of us are infected with to greater or lesser degrees. There's that piece. And then these reality switch technologies. That phrase is actually taken from a book by Andrew Gallimore on DMT and other psychedelics, and we're getting into some of the more speculative parts of the course that I've certainly prepared less at this point. But the point of this section was really just to say technology is not just silicon technology. And actually, we are entering an era where people are becoming extremely aware of some profoundly altering biotechnologies, if you like, or technologies that are interfacing directly with our biology, or in some cases are completely innate in the context of like advanced meditation techniques like the jhanas. So how is it to consider these as technologies along with the AI and the Web3 and so on, and what is the interface between these things? And I know there are people working at that interface. Actually, there's people working with psychedelics and AIs and like having conversations with AIs under the influence of psychedelics as a way of exploring claims about the potential consciousness or sentience of AIs from a different perspective. And I think there's probably a lot of useful work to be done there.
It reminds me at Wisdom 2.0, the conference in San Francisco, I think it was maybe a couple of years ago, they had Sam Altman there and Jack Kornfield, who's one of my teachers. And they were having a conversation, and at one point Jack half jokingly said to him, all you need to do is take some mushrooms, go down to the server room and like connect with the AI to see if it's sentient. And he really was half joking. I could tell it was a joke, but at the same time, it was like a suggestion. And granted, I bet Sam has probably already done that, but that struck me as really being useful, even as a joke, to be inserted into the conversation, because it assumes that, there is some place for spiritual practice, for psychedelic use in exploring like what these technologies are what they mean to us.
Sure. I've been a real fan over the past months of the work of Andres Gomez-Emilton and actually saw him speak a couple of times at the Borderland, the Swedish Burning Man event. He and his organization, the Qualia Research Institute, have this quite explicitly stated aim to kind of build a mathematical theory of consciousness. And how he puts it is that you would never have discovered like the laws of electromagnetism or quantum mechanics if you were just like sitting in a hut without like sufficiently exotic materials around you. Like you would only start really thinking about like the magnetism and potential relationships of magnetism to electricity and so on, like when you come across a magnet, right? It's like you have to then, with quantum mechanics, you could say it's only when you start to investigate the very small that you start to then even contemplate the possibility that there might be different physical laws that are relevant at like different scales of reality. And it says that actually that's the role of psychedelics in a way. Psychedelics like perturb us far from equilibrium, and it's actually it's these far from equilibrium states where actually we often can learn the most in some kind of scientific sense, at least. When we come to questions about AI sentience, AI consciousness, just consciousness itself, actually, it seems clear to me that these skillful perturbations of consciousness in the form of safely and consciously taken DMT or jhana meditation and so on are likely to be important and productive as we come to understand ever more the nature of consciousness, and as we seek to build machines that are in harmony with the things that we cherish and value most. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to doing the research for this course and to speaking to these special guests that I mentioned earlier. And yeah, the course doesn't start until the 17th of December. It goes 17th of September to the 8th of August, 17th of September.
2024, for those listening in the
2024. If you're listening in the future, you might find that the notes are open source, Stephen.
There you go.
Yeah, very welcome to join.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for taking the time to connect today and share a bit about what you're on. It's really cool.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's really cool.
After nearly a year in private beta, the Buddhist Geeks Network is now open for any independent practitioners who want to engage in interdependent practice. You can find out more about the Buddhist Geeks Network by visiting buddhistgeeks.network. And if you'd like to join the community and join us in regular social meditation practice or other events that we host there in the network, all freely offered, you're very welcome to do so, again, by visiting buddhistgeeks.network. Love to see you there.